The advent of the First World War found the government desperately short of military aircraft for the Royal Flying Corps, the flying section of the Army, and the Royal Naval Air Service, its naval equivalent. The urgency now was to put the country onto a war footing. For the British aircraft industry, which then only employed around 1,000 people, this meant suddenly escalating production to meet the new demands. For Sopwith Aviation, the rink became inadequate overnight, and a new factory was hastily constructed 1 block away. So the Canbury Park Road Island site was developed, which remained the headquarters of the company for decades. The bricklayers had to complete the walls around the production of new aircraft. Fred Sigrist was appointed works manager, tasked with putting the company on a mass production basis. The 5.5-acre factory was limited in production capacity from the start, and soon expanded to other buildings outside the island. Even so, there was not the capacity to cope with the heavy demand, and orders for Sopwith aircraft had to be placed by the ministry with other manufacturers. With the pressing need for skilled staff, the industry became a major employer in the Kingston area. By the end of the war, with the success of Sopwith's aeroplanes, some 3,500 people were employed in this building and in a government factory at Ham. With men called up into the armed services, women were drafted into the industrial workforce in large numbers for the first time. The recruitment was led by the Ministry of Munitions, and by 1918 1/3 of the Sopwith workforce were women. Many were employed in stitching fabric, but were also trained in heavier assembly work, making aircraft parts, and in oxyacetylene welding. Everything at the factory was geared to the war effort. Shift working was introduced, and when the electric power failed, the steam wagon was used to drive the shafting and keep production going. It was thought that aircraft would play a part in the coming conflict, but nobody was quite sure how. Flying up until this time had been a pastime and a sport. Nobody foresaw the important role that aircraft would play in warfare. Army commanders in particular were resistant to the use of aircraft. In 1914, General Haig said that the only way for commanders to get information by reconnaissance was by cavalry. There was great concern amongst army officers that aircraft would scare the horses. The Navy, on the other hand, with the encouragement of Churchill at the Admiralty, was more enthusiastic. Their responsibility was for home defence, and they were concerned about Britain's vulnerability to airship raids from German Zeppelins, particularly against their dockyards at Portsmouth and Chatham. At the beginning of the war, aircraft companies worked either for the Admiralty or the War Office, an arrangement to avoid conflict between suppliers. Sopwith Aviation was an Admiralty contractor, but was soon overwhelmed with orders from both the Army and the Navy. The British aircraft industry was an eccentric group of companies such as Shorts, Handley Page, A.V. Rowe, Martinside, and Sopwith Aviation. Some later folded, whilst others became the great names of British aviation. They were regarded by the government as the trade, talented but driven by commercial concerns. Such were the unknowns facing the companies in an industry in its infancy that they tended to cooperate rather than compete. In 1916 they formed the Society of British Aircraft Constructors, later famous for its air shows at Farnborough, with Sopwith Aviation a founder member. Standing apart from the trade was the government's Royal Aircraft Factory at Farnborough. The military establishment assumed it to be the expert in the field, creating the best designs and passing these down to the companies for volume production. In fact, their aircraft were often inferior, and the trade was quicker to adapt to the evolving military role of aircraft during the war. The First World War was the first in which aviation played a significant part. All the principles of aerial warfare were devised in 4 short years, by airmen who made it up as they went along. In effect, they wrote the textbook for all future combat pilots, but at a cost of thousands of lives. It was thought that aircraft would have a reconnaissance use as eyes in the sky. They quickly established their value over reconnaissance by cavalry by providing commanders with intelligence of enemy troop positions and attacks, particularly when the war became bogged down in trench fighting. Cameras were used, giving rise to photographic reconnaissance to build up maps of enemy trench systems. Trench warfare also required artillery spotting from the air. Ranging artillery onto enemy targets from the air proved far more effective than shooting blind. Early in the war, it was not unknown for opposing reconnaissance pilots to wave at each other in a gentlemanly manner as they passed. Very quickly, it was realized that denying reconnaissance intelligence to the other side was as important as obtaining it. So machine guns were installed and aerial fighting began. Then it was realized that aircraft could also be used against ground targets. Aircraft adapted as light bombers could be used to attack targets such as supply dumps, railway stations, and frontline trenches. As technology advanced, bombing became heavier and from a greater range. In the First World War, German Zeppelins conducted bombing raids on London and other British cities. It is not well known that the tactic of bombing the civilian population associated with the Blitz was actually begun in the First World War. Zeppelin raids were later followed by raids of heavy bombers. On the 25th of May, 1917, the first strategic bombing raid on the UK was carried out by Gotha bombers on Folkestone. Nearly 100 civilians were killed and 250 injured. Such raids caused widespread panic and were hushed up by the government, who could see no way of defending against them. As early military aircraft were slow and stable, they became vulnerable to lighter, faster, more manoeuvrable aircraft. So was born the concept of an interceptor fighter aircraft, which became the speciality of Sopwith Aviation. When opposing squadrons of fighters began engaging in aerial combat to gain air superiority, it gave rise to the dogfight and all its associated tactics. It was a form of one-on-one combat with echoes of the knightly past. Propaganda made aces, such as Albert Ball and Manfred von Richthofen, famous. Air superiority meant that your fighters, bombers and reconnaissance aircraft had the freedom of the skies. It was a major strategic advantage, and by 1917 military commanders had concluded that it was necessary to win the war. Control of the air, however, was delicately balanced and dependent upon new technical innovations which could swing the balance from one side to the other. At the beginning of the war, Germany had aircraft superior to any possessed by Britain or France, having obtained the services of the brilliant Dutch aircraft designer Anthony Fokker. He had developed the synchronization gear, a mechanism which allowed bullets to be fired between the rotating propeller blades. This allowed fighters to fire forwards and transformed them into lethal weapons of war. The synchronization gear was first fitted to the German Eindecker aircraft, which blew Allied aircraft out of the skies in late 1915 and early 1916, a period known as the Fokker Scourge. A synchronization gear was devised by Sopwith foreman Harry Corper and was incorporated into the company's latest aircraft, the 1.5 strutter, so called because of its unusual arrangements of struts to support the upper wing. Originally ordered in large numbers by the Navy, where they were known as ship's strutters, they were launched from platforms on the gun turrets of warships and used for gun spotting and reconnaissance at sea. Fitted with inflatable flotation bags, they would ditch into the sea alongside their ship at the end of a flight for recovery by crane. In the aftermath of the Fokker Scourge, however, the Royal Flying Corps was desperate for better aircraft, so naval strutters were transferred to the Army. They arrived on the Western Front in time for the Somme offensive of July 1916 and were widely used for the rest of the war by the British and French, although by 1917 they were outclassed by newer aircraft. The Strutter was an enormous success for Sopwith Aviation, with over 5,000 built, mostly in France. By 1916, Sopwith's aircraft were in demand by foreign air forces as well as the Army and Navy. Fighter pilots were now establishing what strategies were effective during dogfights. It was realized how important it was to be able to outmaneuver and outturn an opponent to get above and behind, the classic dogfight tactic. The ability to climb to a high altitude and gain the advantage of surprise by attacking the enemy from above, preferably out of the sun, was also important. Aces like James McCudden made altitude flying their main attack strategy. Aircraft constructors were still seeking for the ingredients that would make an effective fighter. In a dogfight, an aircraft needed to be light, but also powerful. It needed to be faster and more maneuverable than its opponent, and the pilot needed good visibility. These qualities came together in the Sopwith Pup. The Sopwith team had realized that by keeping the weight of the engine, the gun, the pilot, and the fuel in close proximity, the greatest possible maneuverability could be achieved. In a line of descent from the tabloid, the Pup provided the model for a successful fighter aircraft. The Pup, so called because it looked like the pup of a larger aircraft, could outturn any other aircraft of 1916. It could fly higher than the German fighters and maintain its height in a dogfight, advantages that to a pilot could mean the difference between life and death. As such, it was instrumental in ending the period when the Royal Flying Corps was outflown by Fokker-built machines. Technology advanced quickly, however, in the war, and by early 1917 it was outclassed by newer German aircraft. Naval pups were also flown off ships at sea to provide protection for the fleet ditching into the sea for recovery. However, coordinating the fleet with ship-launched and ship-recovered aircraft was a major problem. A better solution was to land the aircraft on the deck of the ship, and the pup, with its docile handling characteristics, was the ideal choice for trialling this. In August 1917, it made the first successful deck landing. Unfortunately, on the third landing, the aircraft went over the edge. The pilot, Flight Commander Dunning, was killed. The tests overall, however, were a success, and the use of an arrestor wire refined the process of deck landing. These trials paved the way for aircraft to be used at sea from aircraft carriers. It was the only aircraft that could fly high enough to attack German airships. Equipped with rockets, naval pups were used as interceptors and had some success against Zeppelin bombing raids. In a further development, Sopwith Aviation tried attaching 3 narrow wings to a pup fuselage. The idea was to spread the lifting area over 3 wings, thus intruding less into the pilot's field of view and creating a better rate of climb than achieved by biplanes. Thus was born the Sopwith triplane, or the Tripound as it was known, one of the most iconic aircraft of the First World War. The triplane had immediate success in combat earlier in 1917, when it was one of the few British fighters able to hold its own against newer German fighters. But too few were built for it to have a decisive impact. Its combat career was also brief, as it proved difficult to repair. Anthony Fokker, however, copied the concept, and soon German pilots were flying Fokker triplanes. Early in 1917, the impetus in the air war swung back in favour of Germany when the Albatros D3, the most powerful German fighter yet, came into service. In April 1917, known as Bloody April, the Royal Flying Corps lost some 300 aircrew and became known as the Suicide Club. The life expectancy of a British pilot sank to 11 days. The new German tactic of using formations of fighters was also instrumental to their success during Bloody April. Manfred von Richthofen, the most successful ace of the First World War, commanded one of these elite units, whose fighters were painted in bright colours. He was a Prussian aristocrat whose hobby was hunting. Aerial combat became an extension of this. Underpowered British aircraft, such as the Royal Aircraft Factory's BE-2C, were dubbed Fokker fodder by the British press and cold meat by German pilots. The greatest fear of pilots, however, was fire. Fire could destroy an aircraft in minutes, leading to a gruesome death for the pilot. Incredibly, the parachute had long been invented and proved its worth as a life-saving device. Pilots, however, were not allowed to wear parachutes as Army High Command thought it would encourage bailing out. The Navy did not want to carry additional weight merely to save lives. When the public eventually learned that German aircrew carried parachutes, there was an outcry. Orders were subsequently placed for Calthorpe's Guardian Angels. The tide in the air war turned decisively for the last time in mid-1917 with the arrival of the Sopwith Camel. This became the most successful and celebrated fighter of the First World War. The Germans never more regained air superiority, and there was no repetition of Bloody April. The Camel was a development of the Pup and the triplane, but with more power and agility. It was not the fastest aircraft of the day, but no other fighter could match its manoeuvrability. Its handling was very sensitive and needed a good pilot, but in the right hands it became a box of tricks, and was almost unbeatable in a dogfight. The Camel was so called because of the metal cover over the two Vickers guns, which gave it a pronounced hump. The two guns gave it greater firepower than previous fighters. Camels went into service with the Royal Flying Corps on the Western Front in June 1917, and it immediately proved itself to be a superlative fighter. The Camel has been celebrated by many writers, most popularly by W. E. Johns, who wrote the Biggles stories. Famously, the Camel was involved in the death of von Richthofen. Following a dogfight between his Fokker triplane and the Sopwith Camel of Captain Roy Brown, the Camel was credited with shooting him down, although it is more likely that he was in fact killed by shots from Australian forces on the ground. At the Battle of Ypres and Cambrai in 1917, the Camel was used to attack ground targets in support of infantry and for trench strafing. In this role, its vulnerability to anti-aircraft fire from the ground was exposed. Many were shot down, demonstrating the need for greater protection for aircraft. The Royal Naval Air Service had some 600 Camels used to protect the fleet, 250 of which were ship's Camels, specially adapted for operations at sea. Ship's Camels were armed with an upward-firing Lewis gun mounted on the top wing. This was designed for use against Zeppelins. The Camel was a versatile aircraft and could be adapted to carry small bomb loads, which could inflict a surprising amount of damage on targets. In July 1918, 6 camels carrying bombs and operating from HMS Furious attacked German airship sheds at Tondown. They destroyed 2 Zeppelins and damaged the sheds, forcing the closure of the base. This was the first attack in history made by aircraft flying from a carrier. The Camel was the first effective defence against the feared Zeppelins, which could fly higher than the range of defending fighters and anti-aircraft fire, and so could bomb British cities at will. The Pup did not have the firepower to inflict heavy damage, but Camels, operating from warships, were a serious deterrent. There were few aircraft carriers in those days, and the Camel had a limited range, making it difficult to get the aircraft within striking range of incoming Zeppelins. A solution was to tow a Camel on a flat lighter behind a destroyer that could steam towards the flight path of attacking German airships. It was wet and dangerous work for the lighter's crew, whose job was to start the Camel's engine by swinging its propeller and keep their feet in the swells. A ship's Camel was even test-flown from a rig under an airship as a home defence fighter. Something about the aircraft captured the public's imagination, and it became the iconic aircraft of the First World War. The Camel was credited with over 1,200 victories over enemy aircraft, more than any other Allied fighter. It inspired respect and affection among the pilots who flew it. Its difficult but responsive controls made the designation a Camel pilot a commendation. Sopwith Aviation's growing status was reflected by a visit to the factory by the King and Queen. They were shown around by Sopwith and Sigrist, with workers told not to look up, just carry on. Later the royal party went to Brooklands for a flying demonstration by Hawker. Recalling his previous run-ins with the local police, Sopwith asked them not to stop the car, as the King and Queen are in it. As aircraft became more complicated, they took longer to design. Gone were the days of chalking designs out on the floor. R.J. Ashfield, formerly a master at Tiffin's School, was employed as the company's first draftsman. Ashfield later became the company's first chief designer, leading a small team of draftsmen which included George Carter and Herbert Smith, who went on to become designers in their own right. Harry Hawker operated mainly from Brooklands as chief test pilot. He made a practice of flying over the factory and looping the loop. It was thought to show the shop floor staff that the product of their daily work actually flew. Sopwith employees had the satisfaction of doing their bit for the war effort. The company encouraged the companionship of the workplace by organising social events, and the years from 1914 to 1918 were remembered as happy ones by many workers. There were works sports teams, with the management playing a prominent part. Office manager Frank Spriggs had joined the company in 1913 as a clerk employed to look after the bookwork. He was to become managing director of the whole Hawker Siddeley group in the 1940s and 1950s. By 1917, Hugh Trenchard, former pupil of the Sopwith School of Flying, had risen to command the Royal Flying Corps. He was convinced of the need to triple the number of frontline squadrons to ensure aerial supremacy to win the war outright by 1919. Despite improvements, the First World War aircraft fighting on the front line and constructed from just stick and string lasted no more than 8 weeks on average. To build up new squadrons and replace losses required 3,500 new aircraft per month. Clearly, ways had to be found to further increase aircraft production, and quickly. The Ministry of Munitions, now led by Winston Churchill, decided that the solution was to build 4 huge national aircraft factories, financed by the government but run by the aircraft companies. Sites were identified at Croydon, Stockport, Liverpool and Ham. As production facilities at Canbury Park Road were limited, the government requested that Sopwith Aviation concentrate on the production of components, whilst other contractors built the airframes. Sopwith was unhappy with this. It threatened the loss of his experienced workforce and of losing control of the production of his aircraft. So he made a counterbid to lease the factory from the government, and, with no better offers on the table, the Ministry of Munitions agreed. The 8.5-acre National Aircraft Factory No. 2 was built at Ham in less than 6 months, and by April 1918 Sopwith Aviation had moved in, with the first aircraft rolling off the production line in June. By September, production was in full swing. There were huge orders for the next generation of aircraft, Sopwith Snipes and Salamanders. The factory was taken over by Leyland Motors in 1920 and was bought back by Hawkers many years later in 1948. It became the main factory in Kingston when Canbury Park Road eventually closed in 1958. Meanwhile, the company continued to innovate. The Sopwith Cuckoo became the world's first carrier-based torpedo aircraft, although it was developed too late for use in the war. The Salamander was a ground attack fighter, developed in response to the vulnerability of the Camel to fire from the ground, and contained armour plating to protect the pilot, fuel, and ammunition. This design for an aircraft fulfilling a specialist role would have been unthinkable before the war. The Sopwith Snipe was the replacement fighter for the Camel. It was responsible for shooting down at least 200 enemy aircraft in the last 2 months of the war, and was to become the standard RAF frontline fighter until 1926. The Snipe was described as the best fighter of the First World War, but its success lasted only a few months, as the war was to end at least a year sooner than the military planners expected. Nobody had predicted civil unrest in Germany, the mutiny in the German Navy, the abdication of the Kaiser, and the 1918 flu pandemic, which all led to the country's sudden collapse. So when the armistice was signed on the 11th of November 1918, it prompted worldwide celebrations. In Kingston, the good news was tempered by the now uncertain future for the company. However, the company had much to be proud of in its contribution to the war effort. Sopwith Aviation had become the largest aircraft manufacturer in Britain and had produced many innovative designs, sometimes in as little as 8 weeks from idea to finished product. In April 1918, the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service were amalgamated to form the Royal Air Force under the leadership of Trenchard. 25% of its aircraft were from Sopwith Aviation. By 1918, the company employed some 3,500 people. Tom Sopwith, aged 30, had become one of Britain's leading industrialists and a country gentleman, owning the Horsley Towers estate in Surrey. The First World War had produced aircraft of speeds and abilities unthinkable in 1914. Fighter aircraft had emerged and had been proved in combat in a role that still exists today. The government had poured money into aircraft development, and it had become an industry of national significance. The company had played a major role, and recognition duly followed. Sopwith was made a CBE for his contribution to the war effort, and there were MBEs too for Fred Siegerist and Harry Hawker.